absurd that I have to speak about Slovenian art in Ljubljana, but I accept this absurdity as a part of Irvin art practice that always plays with the possibility of the absurd. Yeah, so in this role of speaking of a foreigner in Ljubljana, yeah, speaking about Ljubljana, I would not speak about Ljubljana, of course, and maybe I would even will not speak about Irvin, but I will try to describe the context in which I personally experienced Irvin art, and maybe other people too. So I try to describe a certain field on which Irvin worked or was experienced by the spectators during these years. Now, at the first glance, the art practice of Irvin seems to be a specific version of postmodernism. That was my first impression. Indeed, in the works, Irvin artists combined the quotations from different artistic periods, styles, and movements in a way that was typical for the postmodern art of 1980s and 1990s. On the other hand, Irvin practice is different from the Western postmodernism in many decisive aspects. Now I would like to start my talk by analyzing this difference. The Western postmodernism was a reaction against the modernist canon, against the emergence of the new modernist salon, and establishing of the normative rules of production and appreciation of art. In other words, against the academization of modernism. Indeed, in the middle of the 1970s, the modernist canon dominated the Western art museums, institutions of art education, art market, art history, and critique. The goal of postmodernism was to rehabilitate everything that was repressed and excluded by this canon, a certain type of figuration, like Italian Transavantgardia, German neo-expressionism, photography, cinema, performance, etc. The same can be said about the architectural postmodernism, directed against the modernist architectural canon, and also about literary postmodernism, rehabilitating the literary trash of all kinds. Postmodernism privileged reproduction versus production, secondarity versus originality, anonymity versus individuality. However, Western postmodernism also had its own utopian dimension. Postmodernists dreamed of the infinite flows of desire and information, and of the hive mind or crowd mind that had the power to undermine every attempt to control, secure the meaning of the individual signs. All the signs were supposed to be turned into the empty, free-floating signifiers. That was the time of deconstruction, that was the time of Baudrillard and his infinite plays of signifiers, and so on and so on. Thus, even if the Western postmodernism, in its different forms, was a reaction to the late modernist formalism, it inherited the formalist attitude towards signs and images. All the artistic forms were understood as zero forms, devoid of any specific content of meaning. You remember also how Richter and many other artists undermined abstraction and its claim of expression. So you go so far you want here, and you are confronted with this kind of zero level of experience, zero level of expression, zero level of description, zero level of content, and so on and so on. Yeah, that was the postmodernist dogma. and also utopia at that time. So all the artistic forms were understood as zero forms devoid of any specific content and meaning. According to the postmodernist dogma, all the contents and meanings were permanently deconstructed by the anonymous processes of reproduction and dissemination. The only way to give to the art forms a meaning was to use them artistically, here and now, the meaning of any particular form being totally dependent on its contextual use. And because all the art forms were understood as empty, as mere forms without content, every individual artist got a right to combine and recombine them in every possible way. Thus, the famous death of author became easily combined with the proclamation of the unlimited individual artistic freedom, very strange but very characteristic contradiction of the time. The right of an artist, of individual artist, to use all the forms from the vocabulary of forms and images inherited from the different artistic movements of the 20th century. However, all the combinations and recombinations of these forms became at the end as empty as their individual parts. Now, the emergence of this type of postmodernism was not possible in Yugoslavia as it was impossible everywhere in the Eastern Europe, because the conditions under which art was practiced there were completely different. First of all, the modernist canon was never established, formalized, and institutionalized in the Eastern Europe to the same degree as it was in the case in the West. Even if the modernist trends were allowed in some countries of the Eastern Europe, or even welcomed, as in Yugoslavia, they did not have the same normative power as in the West. Here I mean the normative power supported by the internationally acting art institutions, big money, big collections, and so on. But most importantly, art in general, and the modernist art in particular, were never totally depoliticized as it was the case in the West. In the context of the Eastern Europe, the public space remained ideologically controlled, or at least ideologically charged. The postmodern vision of the totally free, potentially unlimited, even infinite flow of science could never took hold here. All the sciences were not free-floating, but politically charged. And the art forms that circulate in the same space were also politically charged. They were never experienced as empty signs that could get their meaning only through the individual artistic use. Living in a communist society, country, one still felt the close connection of the artistic practices of the early avant-garde to the beginnings of the historical communism. The connection that was completely lost in the West in this form. For a late socialist subject, the black square of Malevich was not merely a self-referential image that initiated the international zero style of geometrical abstraction. Rather, in the socialist country, the black square, as well as other images of the early Russian avant-garde, signified the beginning of the communist era with all its utopian aspirations. Similarly, the old realist images functioned not as a simple, politically innocent representations of landscapes or city scenes, but symbolized a national tradition that was partially denied and partially ideologically interpreted by the regime. The same can be said about art in the social realism and Nazi art. And the same can be said about late modernist art. It was experienced not as production of empty signifiers, but as a commitment to the Western orientation and Western cultural values. So actually, to quote something Western was not to use zero level signifiers. It was to show a certain kind of political orientation in the first place. In other words, every use of this vocabulary of images manifested not the creative freedom of an individual artist, but a certain political stance inside the socio-political field in which this artist lived. Thus, under the socialist conditions, the artist could not, in the Western postmodern manner, operate freely with the empty art forms understood as language without content. Using Heideggerian phrase, one can say under the socialism indeed, die Sprache spricht, the language speaks. The forms that the artist is using are always already ideologically charged, the combinations are also ideologically charged, and so these combinations have their own message that is not merely undermines, but rather overdetermines any subjective artistic message. Now, when Heidegger says die Sprache spricht, he means actually that is a community, the nation, that speaks to the artist, because any language is basically always a national language. And that is precisely the point at which the art strategies of Irving and also some other late and post-socialist artists emerge. The event of the historical communism produced an effect of the broken national identity in the Eastern European countries. The communist ideology was and still is universalist and internationalist. In every country, its worst enemy was a local nationalism that was regularly characterized as bourgeois nationalism. However, at the same time, the epoch of the historical communism was defined by Stalin's decision to build the socialism in one country. From the beginning, it became clear that the socialism in one country will lead to the rebirth of nationalism, and it did. The socialist camp began to split along the national lines. After Soviet communism, we got Yugoslav communism, Chinese communism, Albanian communism, etc., up to the Euro-communism of Italian and French communist parties. However, this national communism remained committed to the universalist message in a certain way. This was already prefigured through Stalin's definition of the socialist realism. Official definition is socialist in the content and realist, in fact national, in the form. It's interesting that realism, that is a mimetic art that was actually supposed to depict the reality, was understood and officially understood as a form. So, understanding of realism was completely formalist. If you want, it was a zero signifier. Yeah? It was somehow removed from its original realistic signification, used as a zero signifier, and then connected to a new ideological content. In this sense, Stalinist, like also late communist art in general, was a kind of proto-postmodernism in itself, yeah? Because it's played with this zerification and definition of the individual science. So this definition presupposed, of course, that the socialist content remained identical through all the different national forms. However, by time, the national form began to shape and thus fragment the socialist content. But this fragmentation did not produce a simple return to the traditional national cultures, understood as specific national traditions and ways of life. Every particular communism had a claim to represent the universal and authentic truth of communism, interpreting the communists of other countries as revisionists. Here the analogy is obvious with the Christianity that was also split along the national lines during the period of Reformation and religious wars. And Yugoslavia understood its own national version of socialism as transnational. First of all, because Yugoslavia was a union of several national republics, but also because Yugoslavia was an important member, one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement. Thus, the late socialist and post-socialist national identity could not be taken for granted. It has these two dimensions, so local national dimension, but always also, maybe paradoxically, local universalist dimension. So certain claim going beyond their own cultural milieu. According to the language, including visual language that the artists were supposed to use, was not given, but had to be reconstructed. The goal of national reconstruction can be reformulated as the goal of retro-avant-garde. I would say that the concept of retro-avant-garde corresponds to the concept of reconstruction. Construction is actually avant-garde, constructivism. Reconstruction is precisely a retro-avant-gardistic move. That means construct the past for the future, but also contrast the future as reconstruction of the past. So to make the past adaptable for the future, but also to make the future adaptable for the past. Now, NSK made this work that was actually, NSK was, I would say, not unique in this kind of strategy. We find, and we can find, elements of the strategy everywhere in the Eastern Europe, also in Russia. But I would say that still now for me, NSK and Irving Group are the model of this kind of strategy. They did it simply better than anybody else. There are many reasons for that. One can say it simply happened. One can say it happened because it was from the beginning a Gesamtwerk project, and that always gives more energy to the project than media-specific project. Maybe it was so successful because the level of philosophical and intellectual reflection in Slovenian society was generally very high. But it seems to me that there is one additional and interesting aspect in that. I already heard that all the Eastern European countries are confronted with the fact that their national identity was broken by the communist experience. But Slovenian identity was broken not in one but in different places. It had to do not only with communist past, but also with German/Nazi past. And that made the problem more difficult, but also more urgent. And so Irving Group found a solution that many other artists and art theoreticians couldn't find. And it is, in fact, the only possible solution. This solution is very simple, as every right solution. Instead of trying to repair the broken identity, Irving integrated into this identity the forces that were supposed to having broken it. In Irving's case, the radical avant-garde socialist realists and Nazi forces. As I came to Germany, I visited a seminar on Hegel that was given by Dieter Heinrich at that time the leading specialist on Hegel. And once after seminar, he invited me to coffee. I thought, you know, you are Russian. I tell you a story that exemplifies Hegelian theory and also involves Russia. I had a friend, and he was a German soldier on the East Front. He was took as a prisoner, sent in the labor camp, released after some time, and as he came back to Germany, he had always the same dream. He is sitting in the middle of the wood, and Soviet soldiers come on him from every direction and are ready to shoot him, and then he woke. And that was several times every night. And so he was completely terrified, but at certain night, something happened in the dream that completely healed him. He never had this thing before, after that. So he's sitting in the same pose. Soviet soldiers come from all the directions, but he suddenly realized they have no interest in him and they don't want to shoot him. And he doesn't know why. So he begins to look himself, and suddenly he sees he's a Soviet uniform. And so they are not interested. And he said that summarized Hegelian theory of dialectic. You always have to adapt to the historical necessity and change your pronouns in a way that you associate and identify yourself with what actually historically is called to negate your existence. And if you do that, if you are able to do that, you are saved. And you are not always saved, you get your piece of my back. So, in a certain way, the history as a soldier, I would say, is the history of NSK and Irving Group in my eyes. They were able to reintegrate, to associate themselves with the forces of the possible destruction and domesticate them. Yeah, make an inner peace with them. Forces are the forces of revolution, the avant-garde forces of socialist realism, forces of the Nazi art. They seem to come from abroad and attack Slovenian identity for all the parts, yeah, like in this wood allegory. But suddenly, they become part of Slovenian national identity themselves. Not because they are born out of this Slovenian identity, no, because they have in this identity the origin, but because they build the specific fate of the Slovenian nation that is actually a historical specific fate. Yeah, it didn't happen to anybody else. It did happen to these people. Yeah? And so, at the moment you integrate your fate in your history, that would save your identity. That what, in my eyes, NSK actually did. In this way, Irving and NSK in general also substantially expanded the field of art forms available to the artist under the standard conditions of postmodernity. At the first glance, that seems paradoxical, because the artist operated in a relatively closed, late communist/punk-communist ideological space. But this expansion of the artistic vocabulary has its explanation. Indeed, the postmodern free and allegedly unlimited play of empty or rather floating signifiers was based on its own rules of exclusion and censorship. the ideologically motivated art of socialist realism or Nazi art were excluded from this play of signifiers. One had moral scruples to empty the related art forms from their content. This content seemed to be too toxic, too contagious, to be completely removed through the operation of aesthetic purification. That is the reason why Holocaust and other crimes of 20th century were proclaimed to be unrepresented. It is not that they cannot be represented, of course can be represented, but the representation being put into the flow of aesthetic science, of artistic science, is in danger to become morally neutral. And by becoming morally neutral, to become actually toxic. One feared that if the related images would be allowed to join the multitude of the modern and postmodern art forms, they will also deconstructed, emptied, and begin to function as pure aesthetic objects. In this way, the toxic, contagious character that will never really go away will become neglected, and thus these images will be able to slowly infect the whole field of modern art forms. This angst of infection of the aesthetic form by the ideological content is still so strong that the images from the period of the socialist realism and Nazi art remain excluded from the contemporary system of art representation also now. And of course I had a long history of discussions with my German friends and colleagues about that, and so I can reproduce the argumentation. And I believe I summarized in a correct way. They think that if you put this morally objectable, morally suspicious, contentious images in a neutral aesthetic field, like museum exhibition of 20th century art, everything, every image in this exhibition suddenly becomes ideological. So the energy, the radiation that goes from these images is so strong that you cannot immunize it. There is no sarcophag that can be put on that aesthetic. In a kind of weak form, I found it also in America, traveling through American provincial cities. I saw a lot of wonderful, really incredibly good executed mosaics and frescoes from the period of New Deal with progressive content, depicting working class, and so on and so on. And there are no books about that. They are not included in the art representations. They are not even reproduction. They are there, but you cannot get any information about them, and they are never mentioned in any American art history, which is more than strange, because they are very good. Now, for Irving, this ideological, toxic character of the art forms referring to the totalitarian regimes was not such a problem, because for Irving all the art forms are ideological toxic to the same degree. Irving does not see art forms as empty signifiers, and thus Irving has no reason to suppress certain images as specifically ideological. So even artists shows that if we accept that all the signs are ideological to the same degree, we actually become much freer in our choice of the artistic forms and means than if we believe that signs are empty. It seems to be paradoxical, but it's really what was shown. A remobilization of the science of the early avant-garde as well as totalitarian art, was also used by Irvin to give more energy to the project of reconstruction of the Slovenian national culture identity. The retro avant-garde means here not only the reenactment of a certain avant-garde attitudes and gestures, but also, and maybe before many other things, the influx of the avant-garde energies into Irvin's artistic practice. The general mood of postmodernity was a certain melancholy after the end of the love affair with the utopia. However, the project to reconstruct Slovenian national identity required some utopian energy that had been got from the sources of radical modernity. But one can ask, of course, do we need today any national culture identity at all? Be they broken and unbroken, simple or hybrid? Is it not better to swim in anonymous flows of information and operate globally in our time of globalization? Yes, today we live in the age of globalization, the internet. Both are effects of the end of the Cold War, an erasure of the ideological divide between West and the East. However, instead of producing the infinite flows of desire and information that was supposed to undermine and ultimately to kill the modern subject of self-reflection and self-control, the internet delivered us to the almost unlimited power of algorithmically organized surveillance and control by the others. In fact, the contemporary globalization is a direct opposite to the modern ideas of internationality and universality. The word of globalization is not a word of international solidarity or shared cultural values. Globalization is also not a realm of anonymous crowd mind, as it was celebrated by postmodernism. Rather, it is a word of global competition of everybody against everybody. This competition pushes the subject who participates in it to mobilize one's own human capital to win this struggle. And the human capital, as it was described, for example, by Michel Foucault, is primarily the cultural heritage that is mediated by family and milieu in which an individual has grown up. That is why the contemporary logic of globalization, unlike the internationalization and universalization of the modernist type, leads to the cultural conservatism and insists on one's own cultural identity. The combination between globalization and extreme cultural conservatism defines the politics of our time. My Western colleagues ask me from time to time, when they remember that I'm Russian, how are the Russian and Eastern European artists doing? Did they already move on from the communist and post-communist times? This question actually means, have they already forgotten repressions and traumas of communism and become what they always were, Polish, Slovenian, or Russian? Under this perspective, for the Eastern European artists to move on means, in fact, to go back to the national culture identity before it was allegedly repressed and distorted by communism. Here the question emerges, of course, how far they have to go back to be able to rediscover and reappropriate the cultural capital. Obviously, Russians have to go at least to 1916, maybe to 1913. That means that on the way to the post-communist normalization and globalization, they have to abandon and subtract from the cultural capital almost the whole 20th century. The situation of other post-socialist countries is not so dire. They have to go back merely to the period before the World War II, but they still lose several decades. And in terms of cultural capital, is not a negligent amount of time. Thus, today the old line between the West and the East emerges in a different form. The West is not supposed to subtract any period with cultural history from its culture. Okay? This produced obvious inequality in the conditions of culture accumulation and capitalization. However, on the level of the official culture politics, this Western point of view is adopted also by many Eastern European countries. We know that. We have this kind of, nostalgic, anti-communist love for the national tradition and its purification from all the distortion through the communists. You know what? A certain kind of struggle against the leftovers of communism that very much reminds me of the struggle against the leftover of capitalism that was taking place under socialism. One can say it's kind of anti-communist perspective of the event of Eastern European real socialism. But I must say that that is a perspective that is completely shared by the Western left. Not because they want to purify historical communism from communism, but because they want to purify historical communism from its national distortions. So from Chineseness, Russianness, and so on and so on. The state socialism of Soviet variety is seen as perversion and betrayal of communist ideal, as a totalitarian dictatorship which was more a parody of communism than its true fulfillment. Thus, from the position of the Western left, the real socialism is simply a delay, it's simply a mistake, historical mistake, and a delay. But this time, not a delay in the development of national identity, but delay in the development of communist ideal. Thus there is, look at you. Thus there is a consensus between left and right in the West that the Eastern European communist experiment should be forgotten, erased from memory. Both left and right reject the historical communism, national communism, and communism in one country, because it offers a peculiar mixture between particular national traditions and the universalist communist project. The conservatives hate communism for contaminating the national traditions that they want to purify from everything communist. And the neo-communists want, as a contrary, to remove all the elements of the national, whatever it is, to restore the communist idea in its absolute purity. In this Stalin's project of building the socialist in one country, produced a very strange phenomenon of hybrid communism, hybridization of communism and nationalism, and thus to a certain folklorization of communism and the artistic avant-garde. Under folklorization, I mean the integration of the communist ideology and avant-garde art into the network of legends and myths that are actually national language and myths. The socialist revolutions inscribed the political utopias and artistic avant-garde into the mass culture of the countries in which this revolution took place, to a degree that was unthinkable for the countries of the West. I'm nearing the end of my time, so I need some kind of a reflection on folklore, folklorization, and the role of romantic poet and romantic painter in creating and exploiting the concept of the folklore. So I would argue that almost all the artists of post-communist era remind one of the romantic poets and painters of the post the era of post-French Revolution. So the revolutionary events went into the folklore of the countries of Europe, and they were changed and modified by the artistic avant-garde of that time, from Byron to Hölderlin, so that at the end you got something like a very artificial form of the folklore, yeah, as a basis for romantic artistic practice. I would say that is what happens now in the Eastern Europe. What we hear now, and I would argue that Irving is a part of it. Part of this romantic folklorization of the hybrid communism with the goal to produce not a utopian but romantic vision of it. And if you want a romantic vision of it, is precisely a retro avant-garde. Yeah? Romanticism is actually retro avant-garde. It's rewriting of the past as a dream of the future. But I would like to finish or to conclude my presentation by saying a couple of words on the concept of the state. You remember at the beginning of the 90s was a big success, was a book by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History and the Last Man, 1992. One can find a lot of discussions about this book, but what's obvious about it is that it repeats in all the details, really, chapter after chapter. The book by, very famous book by Alexander Kojev about the end of history, introduction into the reading of Hegel, where he creates this concept, the end of history, and Fukuyama just rewrites his book. He was actually a student of Leo Strauss and Kojev, but stops before Kojev stops. In Kojev's book, and he follows actually very closely Hegelian original, at the end of the history, is actually marked by the emergence of, as he calls it, universal and homogeneous state. So the end of history is a state, and not the open markets. The Hegelian theory of the state was polemical, directed against the understanding of globalization as politics of the global open markets. And precisely after, before and after the World War II, Kojev repeats this criticism of globalization understood as opening, as economic opening of the global markets, and comes again to the concept of a universal homogeneous state. So he repeats this polemics against, as we call it now, neoliberal ideology, and Fukuyama absolutely misses his point. So he doesn't speak anything about that. Now, we have the globalization, and we have, so to say, half the end of history, yeah? But not the second half. We don't have the state. And I would suggest that the contemporary art world in general, is an attempt to create a non-existing universal homogeneous state. We can say that contemporary art was a huge bureaucracy that is not really appointed by anybody specifically. All this organization, all this, Documentas, Venice Biennial, and many other biennials create an image of the universal global art, international art, in the absence of the subject of this art that could be on the universal state. So it is art of a non-existent state. It's a very interesting aspect, yeah. Also, curator is in French, and the theory was written in French. And actually, already Kojève, I don't want to go into it, already begins to reflect on being a bureaucrat of non-existent state is actually an artistic undertaking. It's actually a kind of artistic action. One should not forget that he was not only a student of Hegel, he was also nephew of Kandinsky. Yeah? So he knew very well what contemporary art actually is. And he also saw Bauhaus and Kandinsky specifically as these bureaucrats of a new state that is not yet there. So the state that is not yet there is a last utopia, so to say. It is a utopia after utopia. And I would say the NSK bureaucracy, NSK state, is really fascinating for me because it's the only one explicit attempt to sematize this aspect of contemporary art. Yeah, because contemporary art pretends to be fluid and anarchist, being completely bureaucratic at the same time. Yeah? And being in this kind, in this way, not very open about its own conditions and presuppositions. And I think that the problem is that a lot of people believe that to be anti-state means to be on the left, but actually to be on the left today means to be for the state, but not for any particular national state, but for the state as such, for this kind of universal state that transcends national borders, and at the same time transcends the thinking and operation on the level of the open markets. Yeah? We have this kind of disbalance between extreme globalization of economy and localization of the politics. We have this basic disbalance. And I would say that art, international art community is an attempt to compensate this disbalance to a certain degree. And I think it is a great achievement of NSK to propose openly this project. And I think that is also the legacy of some kind of utopian, paradoxically maybe, but still utopian internationalist legacy of the state socialism. Because state socialism was, as I said already, was not national. It was state socialism, but it was not national. It was not about national way of life. It was about transnational, even if it was specific here for different countries, it had this transnational potential as this transnational movement inside itself. Yeah. And so NSK project inherited this kind of ambivalence between national project and international claim. And then I can only say that I would love that everybody, I mean not only artists, but everybody on this earth will be a citizen of this state, and that will be the true end of history. Yeah. Thank you.